Okay, so again, we have our two types of population growth. We have where we are having exponential growth, where we have abundant resources, so that biotic potential, the maximum rate at which the population can grow is in ideal conditions. And then if we have limited resources, it's going to lower that and have our carrying capacity be declined. So here we have an example where it shows the decline or lowering of our carrying capacity. An example is the American bison. So it's estimated that the plains region of the United States originally supported a population of about 15 to 100 million bison. But then in the 1800s, there was a bunch of hunting. And by 1890, only about 1,000 bison were left. So a lot of them were massively hunted. Okay, so but in the late 1800s, after that, early 1900s, the U.S. government and private landowners set up a bison protection program to help the bison. And so it started with just small herds of bison, and there were lots of resources, few predators. And so then in 1902, Yellowstone National Park had about 21 bison. In 1915, it grew to 250 bison. So that's a huge, huge growth. And that's going to be exponential growth. So we can see that here at those bison are just increasing and increasing and increasing and increasing. Eventually, though, we're going to reach that carrying capacity. We just haven't yet. So exponential growth is that first. So here it is a growth of 18% from that 1902 to 1915. Okay. So what would be the impact on the environment if it grew to at the same rate, if it continued to grow at the same rate? Think about that. What you might conclude is that if it continued to be exponentially growing, eventually we're going to run out of grass or plant matter for them to survive on, and we will have a really large population that are going to be out competing other organisms and affecting other populations. Okay, so we can also look, we've mentioned before, at population density. So this is looking at the number of individuals in a population in a given area at a particular time. So we're being more specific, not just how many bison there are, but how many bison are in this particular area right now. So it's a slightly more information. So population density tends to be higher where there's more resources available. If we have lots of resources, we're going to have lots of organisms in that small area. Okay, so habitats located in the middle of a population range tend to have a greater population density than if it's on the edges, just because of those resources that are available. A low density population, this is where individuals are spread out. Example of this are territorial or solitary mammals. Herons are an example of this, where they're spread out, so they're not going to be as dense of a population. So here is an example where we have a low density. You can see this is showing like an area, and then we have 3 different herons. They're not all going to hang out together because they're not very social animals, but they're going to spread out. Another example of this low density population is our tigers here, where they're going to be spread out. A high density population, individuals are crowded together. This would be like animals that live in a colony, such as ants or termites, or here we have bees that are all living in one area. So this is looking at the same area, but we have many, many, many individuals all in one very small area. Here is an example of high density with these. I think these are sea anemones, where they're all in one location. And our population density, just like our population size, can change over time and over the area of a population. Okay, so now let's talk about things that affect population growth. So factors affecting population growth are called limiting factors. They're going to limit that resource availability as well as space. They could be biotic or abiotic. So remember, that's living or non-living. So we can characterize them into 2 groups: density dependent factors. These are density or factors that are dependent on the density. So they factors that limit the population growth, and it's based on the size of the population. So if we have a larger population, a density dependent factor is going to affect that population more than if we have a smaller population. So the size of the population affects how much it's being impacted by this factor. Okay, so smaller population, less effect, larger population, bigger effect. This is going to be like examples of interspecific competition for food. So if we have more individuals, we're going to have more competition for water, light, mates, whatever we're dealing with. So this is competition within the species. That would be an example of a density dependent factor. Diseases can also influence this as well too. If we have a large population, you're more likely to come in contact with somebody who's diseased and pass that disease on. And then our interspecific predation, so predators. So if we have a large population, predators are more easily able to find and catch and eliminate organisms from that population. Density independent factors, these are factors that limit population growth, but they don't matter the size of the population. So they're independent of the size. So this is affecting the same no matter if it's a small or big population. Examples of this include natural disasters and forest fires. So they're going to influence and affect our population size. Like if there's a forest fire, we now have a smaller habitat. It's going to affect the size of our population. However, it doesn't disproportionately affect large populations versus small populations. It's going to affect all the populations. So that's an example of a density independent factor. Here's another example of our density dependent versus density independent factors. So our limiting factors here, we have competition, predation, parasitism, natural disasters, and our human disturbances. And here it has a color coding: density dependent, competition, predation, and parasitism and disease are all examples of density dependent. So they depend on how large population size is. If there's more individuals in the population, these will come into play more. While these other ones, human disturbances and natural disasters, they're not going to be dependent on density. So they're density independent factors. Okay, so now we're going to talk about population change. So population change is an increase or decrease in the size of a population. We can use carrying capacity to look at this. So either density dependent or density independent factors can cause that population to get to the carrying capacity, which we've mentioned before. We use the letter K to denote carrying capacity, which I know is kind of silly because it's not in the word carrying capacity, but that is the letter that we use. Okay, so the maximum number of individuals an environment can support. So here in these graphs, we have a carrying capacity shown here, as well as the carrying capacity shown in blue. Notice that there are sometimes we can actually go over the carrying capacity, but that's followed by a quick decline in the population. So it cannot sustain this above the carrying capacity. So this is what I was saying here. If it exceeds the carrying capacity, those factors will limit the population and bring it back down to that carrying capacity. So that carrying capacity, again, is an example of logistic growth. And it's going to fluctuate. Yeah, it'll fluctuate near. It's not necessarily a perfect straight line. It's just going to fluctuate around this carrying capacity. Okay, so that is our notes today on population ecology. Bye, guys.